Hello, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to Women in Literature 2021. This is a literary festival organized by Salim Muzaffar, who is the founder of Aanchal, to celebrate the written word and the females contributing to it. I'm immensely delighted to announce that this panel is the Post-colonial Literature and Women one. In this panel, we seek to explore how the double-edged sword of women's marginalization across Africa, Middle East, and Asia due to race and gender within the paradigms of colonialism and post-colonialism have been transmitted and translated into literature. The discussion will also investigate how a colonized and/or an enslaved woman's spiritual and physical self and identity have been presented in literary works, especially by women writers. We have 4 panelists here today, and I'm going to introduce everyone in alphabetical order. Aanchal Malhotra is a Delhi-based oral historian who works on the 1947 partition and its related subjects. She is the author of the highly acclaimed book Remnants of a Separation, the co-founder of the Museum of Material Memory. Her next book, In the Language of Remembering, is forthcoming in autumn 2021. Next up, we have Dr. Amin Yaqin, who is a reader in Urdu and post-colonial studies at SOAS. She is the chair of the Decolonizing Working Group and the director of the SOAS Festival of Ideas. Her monograph, Gender, Sexuality and Feminism in Pakistani Women's Poetry, is forthcoming with Anthem Press in 2021. She is co-author with Peter Moray of Framing Muslims, Stereotyping and Representation After 9/11 and has co-edited several publications, one being Contesting Islamophobia, Media, Politics and Culture, the second being Muslims, Trust and Multiculturalism, New Directions, the third, Culture, Diaspora and Modernity in Muslim Writing. Her research is interdisciplinary and engages with contemporary contexts of Muslim life as well as the politics of culture in Pakistan, where she grew up. She has been part of 2 projects, the Arts and Humanities Research Council-funded International Research Network on Framing Muslims and the Research Council's UK-funded Muslims, Trust and Cultural Dialogue. She is a book series co-editor on multicultural textualities published by Manchester University Press and on the advisory board of Anthem Studies in South Asian Literature, Aesthetics and Culture, the Pakistani Journal of Women's Studies, Journal of Research, Humanities Punjab University, and the Journal of Commonwealth Literature. Dr. Yaqin is the founding chair of the Center for Study of Pakistan at SOAS and the co-founder of the Center for Gender Studies. Next up, we have Saadia Gardezi, who is a journalist and political cartoonist from Pakistan. She is a Chancellor Scholar at Warwick University. Her research is focused on Western and non-Western political cartoons during the War on Terror era, exploring post-colonialism and international relations. She is the co-founder of Project Dastan that records oral histories of survivors from the partition of India and Pakistan and reconnects them to their ancestral homes across the India-Pakistan-Bangladesh borders using new technologies. She is a former Weidenfeld-Hoffman Leadership Scholar at Oxford University and has worked with various news outlets since 2010, including The Nation, Arab News, and Independent Urdu. We also have with us Soniah Kamal, who is an award-winning novelist, essayist, and public speaker. Her most recent novel, Unmarriageable, Pride and Prejudice in Pakistan, is a Financial Times Reader's Best Book of 2019, a People's Magazine pick, a 2019 Books All Georgians Should Read, a 2020 Georgia Author of the Year for Literary Fiction nominee, is shortlisted for the 2020 Townsend Award for Fiction, is a New York Public Library, a NPR Code Switch 2019 Summer Read Pick, and more. Her debut novel, An Isolated Incident, was a finalist for the Townsend Award for Fiction and the KLF French Fiction Prize. Sonia's TEDx talk is about second chances and We Are the Ink. Her address at a U.S. citizenship oath ceremony about transitions, and her keynote at the Jane Austen Festival was about feminism and global connections. Sonia's work has appeared in critically acclaimed anthologies and publications including the New York Times, Catapult, Vida, BuzzFeed, and more. Sonia's website can be accessed at www.soniakamal.com. Cool. Wow, this is quite a panel that we have here. I'm completely and clearly out of my depth, so I'm going to do the best that I can. Aanchal, I'd like to start off with you, going alphabetically. Post-colonial literature has by and large been about the past, or is at least steeped in memories concerning themes of identity and loss and nostalgia, whether it is written by the diaspora or those in the homeland. Now, in recent times, we have seen social sharp commentary such as White Tiger, for example, or The Social Butterfly. What is the reason for this shift? Is this the next stage of decolonization where we're not using the English language for memories, but in fact as a tool to explore themes in our modern day social constructs?
Oh, I mean, going back to, let's just take language as an example. You mentioned it. The richness of diversity in the languages of the subcontinent itself proves immense fodder for any form of material. And when we talk about the past, if I speak from my own experience, I work on partition. And the first thing I noticed is when you talk to somebody about partition in the language that they are most comfortable with, the memories will be more intact and more poignant from that time because they are expressing it in the way that they think and feel and return to the past. So I think that if we are reclaiming the linguistic landscape, it can only mean that things are moving more inwards. So in that sense, say things like White Tiger, even the book did that, or even Sacred Games, we are talking about film, whatever. But I think even in books, one of the biggest issues I have when writing about partition is simple things like words, the translation of words, the italicization of words, how do we reclaim our mother tongues? And I think that this has begun to a very large extent with writers starting to do it in their own work, and talking about it. So I think it's only a step in the positive direction.
Sure, absolutely. Dr. Yaqin, I'd like to ask you, just going back on what Aanchal said, pre-partition, South Asia had a rich literary heritage, and it was varied in terms of language and substance. But the first identified female writer as a novelist is Babur's daughter, Princess Gulbadan Begum. In fact, it would not be until anti-British activities picked up in the subcontinent that female writers would be recognized, and that too in limited capacity. Does this come down to the impact that the British had on language and their influence on the written word? Dr. Yaqin, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry. I was just saying we cannot underestimate what the legacy of the British in the subcontinent, and certainly the impact that they had on language. So if I just go back to 1800, at that point you have in the subcontinent English grammars, dictionaries, teaching aids, phrase books, translations of literary works, etc., that really are part of the project of colonization that is taking place, that these texts are available both in the colony and in the center. And then you have this point with Thomas Babington Macaulay, who's part of the English administration in India and is a key figure who presented the Minute on Education amongst many other tasks that he was doing. And in that Minute of Education, this message is very clear to the natives that that the project of English education in India is to produce natives who were, quote, Indian in blood and color, unquote, but who could be made, quote, English in taste, opinion, in morals, and in intellect. And also he goes on to say English is better worth knowing than Sanskrit and Arabic. So this really allowed, this kind of messaging allowed English to play a decisive role in cultural hegemony and continues to play a role in how relationships to language are formed to this day. And this is something that I think we it's something that African writers have written about as well. People like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who writes about decolonizing the mind, and that really is something that we still have to work on and do. And you've mentioned, Aanchal there mentioned how people respond to narratives of partition differently when they speak in their own language. And I was really struck by that, because I was thinking, I talked to my dad about his experience of partition, but he speaks to us in Urdu, and actually he spoke to his family in Punjabi. So, these are kind of some of the repercussions, that kind of whole relationship of Punjabi and Urdu actually is a legacy also of empire, in terms of what our attitudes to those languages are now, and how those languages have evolved in terms of their relationship to nation, state, and community. So I'll just
I just want to add something. When I spoke to my grandparents about partition, they would talk to me in Hindi, but they would always speak to one another in Punjabi about the past, always.
Interesting.
But never to us in Punjabi, which I thought was an interesting distinction as well.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely. I don't even know if there's a word for partition. I mean, in our villages, whenever you mention partition, in Punjabi, they just say, Jado addo addo esa, addo ad.
Oh,
wow. It's just a matter of when it was ripped apart. But carrying on from that, so Saadia, I'd like to ask you, in Pakistan, which is still figuring out its identity, there has been little written or documented in the context of partition. There's been limited work. Instead, we have seen non-fiction revolving around saints, heritage, craft, fiction. All of that's been documented, but it has also been done in a limited capacity. But when it comes to written work around partition, very little has been written in the form of fiction or non-fiction, apart from people who have, just peddled a few stories, particularly in Urdu literature. And post-colonial English fiction revolves around big names, Kamala Shamsi, Mohsin Hamid, Daniel Moinuddin. What needs to be done to encourage more writers to document partition, whether in non-fiction or fiction, and the impact that it had on this side of the border? After all, we have witnessed our own partition of sorts with Bangladesh in 1971, and even then there's very little written about it. Why is this, and what can be done to address it?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think it's a very big question about the lack of written word on partition. I think there is a lot written on partition, but I think there is a general trend that there is not a lot written on anything, right? There's so many issues that we see today, face today, that kind of there's, I feel, a lacuna in the way that we write as Pakistanis or as South Asians or as post-colonial subjects even. So I think it's a general lack of attention to literature in I would say modernity, because of the way that we have kind of modulated our interaction with partition or our interaction with coloniality. And in that sense, I'm sure all of you notice, especially in Pakistan, that there's so little said about colonialism and our legacies of colonialism. We have a country that is obsessed with the media, that is obsessed with the news, yet there is no analysis that really draws back into our histories. You've seen just last week that this conference about Bangladesh was cancelled in Lum. So there's actual censorship pressures and pressures that keep discussions away from society and do not allow these issues to become public. As a cartoonist, I also know that there's so many pressures on the visuals as well, about what we can draw and what actually gets published. So I think there's a general pressure that a lot of us are working under, especially writers, about will something be written and then will it be published? Is there space to publish it? You yourself have experiences of how difficult it is to actually publish a piece of work in Pakistan and then allow it to go out into the general public. So I think these are general problems, and I come from the direction not as a writer but more as a journalist in this sense, that I see that there's so many pressures that are not allowing that creativity to flourish. And that really impacts then the way that we talk. And you've already mentioned the English language, our obsession with Western culture. I mean, these are all parts of the way that we've consumed um, our, what the Western world has brought us. So in our identities, I mean, Du Bois talks about the double consciousness of the African or the Black American, and in that sense, we are both trying to be this modernized self even after colonization. Yet we want to save and protect our local cultures, our local languages, but there's this internal dynamic of self-hate going on. I feel that doesn't allow us to really engage with local vernaculars and actually experience the world in keeping in mind that we are ourselves. We're not the other to the Western self or the colonial self. So I think it's a very complex question of why is not enough being written about the theme of colonialism, the theme of partition, and generally what I would like to see, and that's why I love the work Aanchal is doing, is kind of, let's bring out the archive, let's take it out of the academic world and put it back into public discussion and public culture. And I think that's very important for us as writers, to not get caught up in that academic world where everything gets published and it's behind a paywall, but how can we now re-engage those conversations and kind of bring them back to the common man?
Absolutely, absolutely. Those are very, very crucial things, and I completely agree with you regarding archives. Lord knows I've flooded all of your social media timelines going on and on and on about archives. But this is something that you mentioned, this concept of identity and self-hate. Sonia, I'd like to focus on your work and the themes that you explore in your work surround family, identity, the diaspora, cultural clashes, feminism, and so much more. I mean, you always multi-layer your work with so many different themes that one ends up walking away with something new every time I read it. Is this an active effort on your part in terms of crafting a post-colonial narrative that seeks to expose the underlying complexities of being from South Asia today?
Okay, that's quite a large question. First, thank you for having me at this festival and on this lovely panel. With I as all writers, we write what we're interested in, I guess, and the layering comes in. And I've lived in so many different countries and cultures and in between divides and outside of borders and stuff, that I think the layering just tends to happen because it's how my own life has been lived, which is just layer upon layer of otherness and belonging and unbelonging. I think in terms of post-coloniality, because we do call ourselves, or at least Pakistan calls itself, a post-colonial country, culture, I always find the word post-colonial really interesting because on the one hand, of course, when it comes to British Empire, we're definitely post that. But there's so many other methods of colonization, be it gender, be it class, be it language. And so there's never really any post per se. We're always in the present of some sort of colonization. And those are the scenes that I like to pick apart when it comes to feminism, when it comes to class divides, etc. When it comes to partition also, 1947 is, of course, I would say the mother of partition in Pakistan or the subcontinent. However, with Pakistan, we also see 1971, and we also actually see, when we go back, we see Kashmir also. And my first novel, An Isolated Incident, is actually about partition, 47, as well as the partition of Kashmir between the two separate countries and the ongoing divide and conflict and what it means on the ground for those people. And then with Unmarriageable, which is very particularly, I mean, it wasn't some fun project, Austin project for me. It is very, very particularly, I call it a post-colonial parallel retelling. And parallel because I literally meant to and did take a beloved British classic, in this case, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and I set the entire thing in Pakistan. So it follows the same plot, it follows the same characters, all of that. it was very deliberate. And going back to what Amina was saying about Macaulay, one of my epigraphs very much is verbatim what she read out in Minute on Education, because the first time I came across that, I was doing my independent study, and my first language is very much English. I come from Urdu-speaking background, and my mother's from Srinagar, Kashmir, so I understand both the languages. But English is very much my first language, and I've never had a necessarily antagonistic relationship with it, because in 1947 Pakistan made English one of its official languages. So I very much seen English as a Pakistani language, no matter what the general gist of it may be in the air. However, to read Macaulay and his recommendation in Minute of Education 2 throughout British Empire to replace the indigenous languages with English, and therefore to create these divided people, was a huge shock to me, because it was a very nefarious origin of the language that I call my own, and that I write and think in, that we're all speaking in today. And I wanted to fuse this very nefarious origin with the ground reality of English, and it just made, and for me that meant taking a British classic, Pride and Prejudice, and like I said, transplanting, remapping, reorienting it into Pakistani culture, something I would have wanted to read myself growing up, but I didn't get to read at all. And in fact, Seattle University's Professor Nalini Iyer, she was interviewing me, and she actually called, I think she gave me the biggest compliment I could ever get for this novel, or perhaps ever, but she called Unmarriageable Macaulay's nightmare. And it was interesting to me that coming from the subcontinent, she understood it wasn't just some fun, Austen retelling or whatever. It was very much post-colonial parallel. And that calling it Macaulay's nightmare really did sum up for me the reason I did that. So yes, I think post-coloniality definitely in everything I write, and just where we are geographically and where we are in the world as women, etc., perhaps colors all of our works, especially mine.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Sonia. On the basis of that, Aanchal, I'd like to ask you that, you have Sonia's book, Unmarriageable, and it's sort of exploring the role of women in society and how Regency Britain and modern day Pakistan are so similar. For non-fiction, especially pertaining to history, there's a tendency to stick to the usual tropes of history and politics, both of which are very important. I certainly don't say that don't explore it, they are very important, but there's very little focus on female public characters that actively rejected playing the roles of what was expected of women, and they emerged as forces of change and carved their own identities. And that too at a time when it was even far more difficult to do so. In this post-colonial world, we now see some fantastic work emerging on women like Vati, Jinnah, Princess Sophia, Dalip Singh, and of course, Ira Mukherjee's Daughter of the Sun, where she explored the role of the Mughal women and what their role in the Mughal Empire. What is the cause for such limited literature on females from South Asia? I mean, Vijay Sai's Drama Queens just came out, about 2 years ago, and when I read that book, I was just blown away, and it was such, although credit goes to him for putting it together, but it was such a small, slim volume, and I kept begging Vijay that you've got to give me more. This is not enough. Why is there such limited literature on females from South Asia?
It's growing. I wouldn't say it's completely limited anymore. But it's interesting. I'm hearing. I noticed right now that I'm the only Indian on this panel. Is that right? Okay. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, but we didn't.
It has nothing to do with anything except the fact that partition literature is kind of burgeoning in India at the moment.
Yeah.
So it's interesting for me to listen to the Pakistani perspective.
Yeah.
That being said, the question that why isn't there so much literature on women from the past kind of is in the fact that not enough women were writing about it, which is now changing. In the last, you mentioned Ira, and I will tell you several other people who are writing about historical protagonists that are women in nonfiction specifically, but diversity of the writer, whether in background or thought or gender, is as important as the diversity of the historical protagonist. right? And I think you are talking about women that left a mark on society, but my issue goes one step beyond. What about the women that were just common women? Do they not deserve their own archive? Because even if one was not educated enough to leave archives or texts, as most of these women that you mentioned, Sophia Duleep and Mughal women were able to, the average woman, let's say in colonial Punjab, wasn't educated enough, perhaps couldn't read or write, which is where Saadia's point about oral archives comes in, which is why oral history is such a fabulous source in rebuilding the personal past, because it uses the voice, which is it's available. Everyone can talk about their experiences. So not only was for a long time history dominated by men, but it was also written by men. And it is so tiring, to be honest. As a woman historian, going back to a colonial era where I want to read about women that I can relate to, and there are so few, it's exhausting, but that is changing. When you look at archive, when you look at family trees or genealogy trees, women are omitted. Women are referred to by their husband's name or their father's name. And because of the patriarchal society we live in, this was accepted for a long time. But this is changing, and Ira Mukhoti is one. Anita Anand writes about Sophia Duleep Singh. Shabni Basu writes about Noor Inayat Khan. Priya Atwal writes about the women of the Sikh empire. Gayatri Bahadur writes about Kuli women, the indentured labor, through the story of her own great-grandmother. So in itself, the diversity of those subjects is incredible, because I also think, whatever people say, women look at history in a very different way. How they live history, how they talk about it. I can speak from my own experience of recording interviews of partition. Partition was a gendered event, of course, in the way that it affected men and women differently, but women also perceived it differently. Women also rebuilt differently. So naturally, women will also look at historical times differently. And I'll give you a small example. Earlier last year, I wrote a chapter in an anthology about Dr. Usha Mehta, who started the Congress Underground Radio during the Quit India movement in 1942. She was a 22-year-old student. She was a decade younger than I was, and she was no less than a seasoned revolutionary. It was so inspiring. But no one knows about her. Everyone knows about Congress Radio, but no one knows it was a young woman who started it, who spent 6 years in jail for it. So I think it's not just about awareness, it's also about recognition.
Absolutely.
And I want to look at historical protagonists that I can relate to. So naturally, I'm going to gravitate towards their stories. And it's changing. I mean, just look at this panel, right? We are all trying to work towards the same thing. And I know that a lot of us depend on oral history, but I would draw attention to Saadia's project Dastan, which not only looks at, like, I write about oral history, but the voice, again, going back to language, the voice, the face, the gesture, it is so imperative in understanding the historical narrative, what is said and what is unsaid as well.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree with you, and 110% with you when you mention that it's not just about public females, it's also about the everyday women. What were they going through? What were their experiences? And that's something that's a personal preference of mine as well. In fact, Dr. Yaqin, on the basis of that, I'd like to ask you that in Pakistan, pre-partition and partition life was immortalized in Urdu literature by female writers such as Kurutul End, Aaka Darya, or even Ismat Chughtai's own memoir. Today, these works are not to be found in mainstream literature works or even taught at school until one actively pursues Urdu literature at higher education. Why is this the case? Does the female experience, as Aanchal has mentioned, pertaining to partition and partition, is it not considered good enough? Is it not applicable culturally? Does it not matter historically?
Thanks, Mehr, for that question. And just to connect to some of the points that were made with regards to history, to the reclaiming of history, the importance of the archive, and the question of agency, I want to put put that in there because we are talking about the agency of women in these narratives and how to reclaim them. So we have, if we go back to the British colonial context and we think about the archive, the archive has a very specific type of presence and the way we think about it in the kind of discipline of history. And then, of course, I'm thinking of the work of somebody like Gayatri Spivak and the question of can the subaltern speak, and how it really helped us to move forward in the way we thought about the traditional archive and what is the role of the archivist. Is it possible to make the subalterns, it brings up the question of representation, who represents whom, and it brings up the question of power and knowledge, who has the power, who has the knowledge, who can speak for the other type of thing. But also the fact that we need these voices, that we need to hear alternative voices. We don't just need to hear the queens and the kings, but we also need to hear the ordinary people. So I think with the question of Ismet Chughtai and Qurrat-ul-Ain Haider, I think they're very important writers, but also I think we should acknowledge that they're very elite writers as well, right? In the canon, and it's more that those are the writers that do get recognition, if any writers get recognized. But what I will kind of respond to is that question about the autobiography and the life writing, what I'll refer to as like to think of as life writing. I mean, I've written about this in various contexts in different work that I've done about what women's life writing does and how important it is from the context, both testimony, memoir, the oral kind of context comes into play here, as well as the autobiography, the more formal autobiography as well, and how they can open up a different way of thinking. So it's really interesting, because Ismet Chughtai work is spoken for all the time. She's spoken for. Obviously, she's got, a novelist may just want their writing to speak for them. They may not want to interpret their writing. I think that's very hard with contemporary novelists because we always get to ask them what they're thinking about and what they're doing. But in her, I've had the opportunity to read Gardezi Hai Perahan, and I think what's really interesting in that book is when Ismet Chughtai writes about the negative family and public reactions that she faced for Lehaf, the short story that really shook kind of the Urdu literary world to the core, and also the fact that, even people with progressive sensibilities and left radicals felt that this was a little bit too much. This was a little bit too kind of too radical to have in the mainstream. So she says that the only support she had was from Saadat Hassan Manto, who also had an obscenity case filed for his short story Boo. And he told her to be proud of her work because it's again, this is a male writer, you've got to remember. He says it's the only great story you've written. And Chughtai's personal life, she says, was actually invaded by filthy letters filled with such invective and convoluted obscenities that they had been uttered before a corpse. It would have got up and run forever. She became distraught by the personal attacks made on her entire family. When her husband Shahid saw the letters, he threatened her with divorce. She decided to keep a low profile, burning the correspondence and maintaining silence over newspaper reportage and public gatherings that discussed her story. But the damage was done, and she confesses that married life became a battlefield. And although she won the court case, Chughtai felt she had lost, as Lehaf became the defining feature of her career as a writer, and everything that she wrote was always measured against it. So I think, that's the narrative that we don't know. That's the kind of context that we don't hear about. And those are the battles that women face in doing, sort of going against the grain or doing something that they want to tell and write about, but the pressures that kind of come back at them. I think whether these types of stories will be included in the curriculum, we go back to the question of ideology, and we go back to the question of, and I know if I can answer this in a reverse way, I've also written on Anita Desai's In Custody. which is set in India, and it talks about the perspective is told from that of a Hindi teacher who is teaching Urdu in India, and how that becomes really the death of Urdu. Language is communalized, right? In the world that we live in the subcontinent, language is not a quote unquote free choice. It is a communal choice. It becomes, or it's communalized in the way people respond to it. And then also you've got so many, I think this was the point Soniah was making also about writing in English, which I think is really interesting. And Indian writers in English have also said this, that English becomes this kind of, the English novel becomes this secular space to write in, because you are not faced with the same types of power dynamics that you get attached to within those other contexts. I mean, for instance, I'll give you an example of Fehmi Daryaz, the writer Urdu poet that I worked on. And one of the really interesting things that she said was when she wrote in, she's very proud of being a Sindhi as much as she is of writing in Urdu, but she said she was also, in terms of the Sindhi writing that she supported and appropriated, that she was also then be expected to be part of the Sindhi nationalists, and she was kind of a little bit torn. She's not a nationalist in any kind of sense of the word, with all due respect to her, because she's speaking for the subaltern, and she's speaking for her politics is a very particular type of feminist politics. So language is so kind of complicated when we start unpacking it, because there's so many layers to it. So, that's a really long kind of answer to your question, but I hope it sort of...
No, absolutely. Thank you so much. That was a really detailed and comprehensive answer, and it's certainly got me thinking from a different perspective. Saadia, based on what Aanchal had said about the oral history side of colonial history and partition, you've taken post-colonial expression to another realm which has been dominated by men, as in the digital realm and technology. You merge visual with literal. What has been the impact of your work? A book, for example, has its own impact, but with Project Dastan, what's been the impact, and do you see patterns of colonial behavior today in your work as a cartoonist when you write your work for Pakistani newspapers or the Pakistani media?
So these are two different questions. I think with Project Dastan, which is kind of like creates a visual archive that people can actually engage in. The concept was to bring text out and make it visual. And I, as a journalist, as an artist, I feel that visuality is something that's very important, and that's not really evaluated or analyzed in academic literature to the same extent that text is. And it also frees us from some of the constraints that a text in certain languages put on us. So I think it's very important, whether it's the cartoon or whether it's film, that it has a kind of a different interpretive impact on people. So for Project Dastan, the idea was that we have all these archives sitting in boxes in various universities in various places that are difficult to access. People don't know a lot of these histories. There's after 70 years of partition, there is kind of a lot of misinformation that Indians have about Pakistanis, Pakistanis have about Indians. So the idea was to kind of go back to our grandparents' generation, speak to them, and see what we can do with their stories and how we can project them outward. So one of the ideas was to, we want to also give back to that generation and give them maybe closure in a sense, where we virtually transport them back home. So we go to their villages, we find anything that is still existing, if it's their home, if it's a tree, if it's a well, we film it in 360 and we give the partition witness a VR experience. And in that effort, we have tried very hard to have a good balance of female stories, and it kind of comes from the realization that yes, female stories are different, they experienced partition in a different sense, but also it reflects how different traumas can be and how we look at partition as this one monolithic event, but there's so many angles to this. It's not just, we've had a focus on Punjab, we've had a focus a lot on male narratives of violence, but what was happening to women at the time. And not even just Punjabi women. What happened to a woman who, for example, went from Lucknow to Karachi? And we felt that if we are looking seriously at what trauma means and how maybe that impacts intergenerational trauma, then just the fact of leaving home is also traumatic. The fact that you were concerned about your jewelry, for example, or there were things that you were leaving behind, or there's stories where somebody's mother gave birth on the eve of their migration. So the women's stories present a very different narrative, and it's a very different memory of partition that hasn't really been looked at. So what we are trying to do is now amplify those voices of women through our work. And I just want to refer back to one of the writers that influenced me a lot in this project with partition is Begum Ruqayya Husain, who writes this wonderful science fiction story about this utopia that she imagines without men. There's this world that women have created. It's full of flowers. It's there's flying saucers and stuff, but it's this very early, I think it was 1908, when she imagines this world. And I think that was in a big moment in feminist literature that came up, and I think that's influenced me in a lot of sense too, when I look at the story of women and the dreams that women have and what they wanted and what they expected from partition and what they generally expect from their lives. And there's so many stories. I mean, if you look at the work of Urvashi Butalia, of women who were kidnapped, were married off, and then the Indian government tried to kind of get them back, but these women realized that when they came back, their families didn't want them anymore because of the way that they were tainted by the experience of partition, and how how their lives actually were once they were forcefully converted or married. So I think those narratives exist, but bringing them out and amplifying them has been kind of like what Project Dastan has tried to do. As far as cartoons are concerned, I mean, we're already discussing visuality. Spivak has been mentioned, this idea that we're writing in English, but we're also writing about the subaltern, and we're writing about the vernacular, but we're still privileging a certain language and a certain perspective. And we need to be kind of reflexive on the kind of work we're doing. So for cartoons, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that if you look at political cartoons in Pakistan, you'll see that, if you want to represent the common Pakistani, it's never a woman. If you want to represent a professional, it's never a female professional. If you represent the military, for example, it's never a female soldier, general, etc. So there's a big difference in the way that we represent our national imaginary when we're drawing political cartoons. And I've become very aware of that as a woman, that generally you have so many cartoons where this, the man is sitting on a couch watching the TV, making a comment about the politics, and the poor woman is always like standing at the back or making tea or carrying tea. And those representations have existed in the last 70 years if we actually look at all the cartoons. So I think for me, being one of the few female cartoonists in this very big community of cartoonists who are male, I think those representations not surprise me, but they give food for thought in the way that I want to draw politics, or the way that I see how cartoons are drawn. And as soon as you add female cartoonists to the mix, there's Reem Khurshid who draws for Dawn, for example. There's Nigar Nazar. Then the narrative changes, the stories changes, the political commentary changes, and that diversity I feel is missing in Pakistan to a large extent when we look at politics and how politics is visualized. So that's just, I guess, an observation that I think we need to now maybe look at how newsrooms are constructed, just the presence of one woman in a newsroom changes the way that news gets reported. And I don't want to valorize it, that women are always think of things in a better way, but the diversity that comes with a different lens on the news. So I think that those are kind of my two comments about like women in the archive and then the visual of the cartoon.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you on the representation of females in visually speaking. For example, when I was doing my book and we came across these print ad archives from pre 1960s and pre-partition ones, actually, it was funny. It could be an advert about pajamas or beauty cream, and you'd always have the man standing in front and the woman standing at the back. And in the context of Pakistan, it wasn't until I think the 1970s that women finally began to stand side by side with men, but their eyes would always be looking down. And I'm talking about fashion because that's what I had focused on, and pop culture. So you're spot on about the female representation in the visual format. Sonia, I'd like to ask you, carrying on from what Saadia has said about female characters, what has caused Pakistan's literary stagnation? In your book, Unmarriageable, you take a Jane Austen book and put it in a South Asian context. Where are the female characters that female readers today can identify with? And why is it that our female writers got completely silenced, either by lack of opportunity or societal pressure? And in this day and age, where the country has entered a new phase, I suppose not necessarily post-colonial, but certainly post-war and somewhat post-Sia, surely new art, literary work ought to be created in which the modern Pakistani woman is able to put forth characters that readers can identify with, particularly female readers. I think we've lost Sonia. Well, we'll wait for her to come back. In the meantime, Aanchal, I'd like to ask you a question. In partition, so much remains in mystery or is lost. And yes, there are archives, there are efforts to document things in the written word and orally as well. For example, efforts like yours to create post-colonial literature, service documentation, as well as personal narratives. What is the next stage? Where do we go from here? The written word, while it does last, the impact is what matters. What impact do you wish to have, especially with the translated version? I see Sonia's back. Sonia, we'll just come back to you. I've just asked Aanchal a question. Aanchal, if you could, please.
I think the obvious next step is Project Dastan. That's the first part of the question. That's the most obvious step, because it's one thing to write about narratives of partition. It's a whole other thing to show people where they come from. And there is an incredible amount of honor and poignancy and emotion attached to that. So that's the first step. For me, yes, my book has been translated into several languages, and that opens up readership. And it also brings the narrative back. It gives the narrative back to people who are interviewed that may not actually be able to read English. I think in English, though we are interviewing one another in regional languages. My first language is also English, and I write in it and think in it. So having it in Hindi or Punjabi or Urdu or Bangla or even French for that matter, opens up a whole other world of readership and commentary. But for me, it's going to sound like such a silly thing, but I have one dream in my entire, whatever I do in my life, my dream is one surmounting dream, is that I am tired of defending Pakistan, because I do it so often to Indians every day because of how the media portrays it. And I'm sure Pakistan does the same thing to India. But the point is that shouldn't be the case. That shouldn't be what scholars that work on both sides of the border keep doing, defending one another. Ordinary people should also want to make that effort themselves. So my dream, eventual learning from writing about partition, is that I write for my generation. I'm a millennial. I'm in my 30s. I want to write for other people who are my age, who have not had the opportunity to go to the other side as I have. And I realize that this is a privilege that almost nobody I know has. it's such a rare percentile of the population that's actually able to do that. So my one hope for the future with my work or works like Saadia or other oral historians or anybody who works on India, Pakistan, is that one day it will be easier for us to cross over to the other side to see where our grandparents came from with dignity and ease. And if I can help, or if works like ours can help ease that visa process, then that is something that is for the betterment of the future, for sure. And with the opening, it's such a simple thing. With the opening of the visa process, you visually see that something is similar to you. You listen that something is similar to you, and it is not in congruence with what you see in the news. You are able to base opinions on what you see and people you meet, and it just busts a lot of myths. So I think that my hope for the impact works like mine have is that there will eventually better relations between our country, because that's the only way the subcontinent will prosper collectively.
Absolutely. Thank you, Aanchal. And I agree with you. It's about time that we were able to come and go freely and have more access to our own history on both sides of the border for both countries. Soniah, last question is for you. Your book, Unmarriageable, takes on a Jane Austen book and puts it in a South Asian context. Where are the female characters that today young female South Asians can, especially Pakistanis, can connect with? At what point did female writers get completely silenced, either by lack of opportunity or societal pressure? And in this day and age where the country has entered a new phase, somewhat post-colonial, post-war on terror, surely new art, new literary works ought to be created.
I think the future looks pretty bright. There are new things, new works of art, new novels, writing, non-fiction being created every day. Now, publishing is a separate aspect which this panel is not about, which is how to get those voices out, how to get those books, published and where. And as we know, Pakistan is struggling very badly with its publishing side of the equation right now, especially after the ban on imports of which books are included between India and Pakistan. And once again, it comes down to 47 partition and the ripple effects, huge tsunami effects at this point that we still continue to see between both countries. As far as female protagonists are concerned, though, I think it's always interesting to see which gender tends to write in whose perspective. So with Isolated, I wrote through both, it's a dual narrative. It has a male perspective protagonist as well as a female. And Unmarriageable is told through all female voices. There are 5 Bennett sisters, in my case, Binnat sisters, which in Arabic translates to the girls. And each of them has a different personality, and apparently, according to readers, they're able to connect to them. One of them suffers from fat shaming. Another one there's one who's cut, Alice, the main character, has cut her hair really short. She likes to suntan. She goes against the grain in every single way, and she hears about that every day. And a lot of girls, not just Pakistan, but I hear from my Indian readers, Bangladeshi readers, across the subcontinent and across the world. There's so many readers who write to me and say that, oh my God, Unmarriageable is just like us. And I'm like, oh, you're Pakistani also. So, when it comes to writing female protagonists and stuff, it really does come down to relatability. And I think relatability is universal. I mean, if Jane Austen and her themes, which are still very relatable 200 years down the line, then, our own legacy of be it Kurtalan, be it Ismat Chuktai is very relatable also. I have an essay on scroll.in about, it's called Muslim Girls Do Not Write Sex Stories, because one of the very first story I published, Papa's Girl, was about pedophilia. And I was attacked brutally, and this is 20 years ago, brutally for having written about such a subject, to the point where I was called a porn writer. I was told, someone wished that I'd never have children or sons. And it was my very first experience with this sort of attack and censorship. And it sort of firmly, and I wrote an essay about that because I had to unpack the internet was not what it was 20 years ago. So I had to scramble into research where I was the first person being attacked this way. And unfortunately, again, coming from an English background, I was very dependent on the translations of Urdu writers or regional writers of Pakistan, the subcontinent. And I did get hold of, Manto and Ismat's trials with the law and with what they'd written. And the lihaf definitely came up. And it was so interesting to me. And I write about that, how Ismat definitely did pay for having written the lihaf, and it cost her personal life a lot. Her marriage nearly did disintegrate, but funnily enough, the same did not happen to Manto, who was a male, For Manto, even though his family struggled financially, Manto seemed to be very excited about the fact that he was going to go back in court and he'd have his day and he'd be able to, and that gender difference between what Ismat felt being the female, no matter how strong and wonderful and dynamic Ismat was. And if you just listen to her oral interviews, which are available online, she's fantastic. I mean, she's so wonderful. And yet, she, for what she'd written and for the attention it got, the malattention it got, she suffered so much when it came to her domestic life, which always made me wonder, what is it that puts us in our place, so to speak? Who is it that puts us in our place? And how do we push against those places and those boundaries? And for me, it was a very, very difficult thing to hear that a story about pedophilia was being put in the porn category, and I was trying to be, put into a category. Or it was very disturbing. And Ismat and Manto, etc., and that legacy definitely helped me. Another thing I think that I'd love to see Pakistani writers and actually subcontinent writers address is friendships across the class divide. And this is something I really focused on in Unmarriageable, where I have my Elizabeth Bennet, Alice Binnett character, and my Charlotte Lucas, Sherry Lucas character. They're from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Elizabeth is upper class and Charlotte is from the lower middle class in Pakistan. And often, as we know in Pakistan, these two classes tend not to really meet or really have any, oftentimes, I mean, I don't want to talk in generalizations or stereotypes, but sometimes the lack of friendships between these classes, because they speak in different languages, Urdu versus English or regional language versus English, they go to different schools per se, but it so happened I put them in the same neighborhood, so to speak, because of circumstances in the novel. And they become fast friends. And another wonderful compliment I received actually for Unmarriageable was the review by Nughat Kamal, fantastic reviewer, in dawn.com. And in it, she writes that I'm probably the first Anglophile author who has tackled and written about the class divides within Pakistan, very well. And I was very, very excited to read that because I worked very, very hard on that. Because often, as we know with the ground reality in Pakistan, there's no one Pakistan. There are myriad Pakistans. There are 100 Pakistans, depending on your socioeconomic background, the language you speak, so many factors. There are so many Pakistans, and to bring these Pakistans under one umbrella in one novel and stuff was something I really wanted to do with that, because like your question had asked, relatable characters, female protagonists and stuff. I didn't want this to be yet another novel from Pakistan which focused on the upper middle class and their issues and whatnot, or it focused on, the downtrodden woman who needs to get out desperately and honor killings. I didn't want to do any of that. I wanted to write a contemporary novel about Pakistani women who go to the theater, who jog in the park, who, go to cafes and drink coffee and talk about their mothers and boys. And but I wanted to do this against the class divide also. I wanted to have as many women as possible read Unmarriageable and see themselves reflected in it, because I was very loath to find novels set in Pakistan where I could see myself, which wasn't someone who was necessarily downtrodden in the traditional sense of the word, especially the way the Western world thinks of us as downtrodden. Many of us, I mean, look at us on this panel. We're educated, we're talking, we have a great sense of awareness about stuff. And yet I'm sure in our personal lives, a lot of us have come about patriarchal circumstances, which we've had to fight against and push against. And that's the novel I wanted to write with Unmarriageable. And I'm hoping more and more Pakistani authors and subcontinent authors will definitely, especially Pakistani authors for sure, will write about characters across the class divides, and will be writers from different classes who are able to write characters who can. yourselves.
Thank you, Sonia. We've run out of time, so unfortunately I can't ask my panelists for any last words, but I just wanted to say thank you so much, Dr. Yaqin, Aanchal, Sonia, Saadia, for your input. You've certainly left me reeling. My head is spinning with so many thoughts and ideas right now. Thank you for your time, and thank you so much for being part of this Lit Fest. Look after yourselves. Take care. Bye-bye.